The owner of a bankrupt auto repair shop gave shelter to a beggar and his son on a cold night. At dawn, he was paralyzed to see what the old man was doing with the boy under an old car. The rain began to fall hard on the tin roof of the workshop, creating a constant metallic sound that echoed through the nearly empty shed. David walked slowly between the workbenches, carrying in his hands a box of rusty tools he hadn't used in years. His back ached from accumulated tension, and his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight that grew with each hour. He placed the box on a dusty shelf and looked around, feeling the tightness in his chest increase as he observed the peeling walls and old machines covered with dirty cloths. The dim light from a single lamp hanging in the center of the space cast long, distorted shadows, making everything seem even more abandoned. David ran his hand over his tired face, feeling his unshaven beard scratch his palm, and sighed deeply. 48 hours, he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse and choked. The crumpled eviction notice weighed in his shirt pocket like a stone he couldn't let go of. He approached the wall where there were still some framed photographs, covered by a thin layer of dust that testified to the abandonment of recent months. David reached out and cleaned the glass of one of them with his sleeve, revealing the faded image of better times. In the photo, he appeared younger, with a wide smile and eyes shining with hope. Next to his wife and young daughter, all in front of the newly painted sign of the workshop on the day of its inauguration. That had been the realization of a dream built with sweat and sacrifice, brick by brick, tool by tool over 20 years of hard work. Now, looking at that image frozen in time, David felt as if he were observing a stranger's life. His hands began to tremble as he held the frame, and he needed to rest it back against the wall. 20 years thrown away, he thought, feeling his eyes burn with tears he refused to let fall. The storm outside began to gain strength, and the wind howled through the cracks of the poorly sealed windows, bringing gusts of rain that wet the concrete floor near the entrance. David returned to the center of the workshop, picked up a wrench that was on the bench and absently twirled it between his fingers. He thought of his wife who had left him months ago, taking with her their daughter and all the dreams that still remained. Her words still echoed in his mind like a scratched record. She had packed in silence, avoiding looking him in the eyes, and when she finally spoke, each word came out like a stab. "I can't live like this anymore, David," she had said, her voice cold and distant. "You've lost yourself in this workshop and forgotten you had a family." He swallowed hard, squeezing the wrench tightly, and felt anger mixed with pain form a tight knot in his throat. A thunderous clap tore through the night sky, making the walls of the workshop tremble and pulling David from his thoughts. He dropped the tool back on the bench and walked to the small side window, observing the curtain of water falling relentlessly on the outer courtyard. The trees swayed violently with the wind, and lightning briefly illuminated the desolate landscape before plunging it back into darkness. David rested his forehead against the cold glass, feeling the contrast with the heat emanating from his own body, and closed his eyes for a moment. The fatigue was such that his muscles seemed made of lead, heavy and painful, but he knew he wouldn't be able to sleep. Not today, not with the eviction deadline approaching like a guillotine about to fall. "Tomorrow I need to start packing everything," he said to the emptiness of the workshop. The words sounded hollow and meaningless. That's when he heard the knocking. Weak at first, almost imperceptible under the noise of the storm, but persistent enough to capture his attention. David raised his head, frowning, and turned toward the entrance gate. The knocking came again, a little stronger now, accompanied by the muffled sound of a voice he couldn't distinguish through the thick metal. He hesitated, looking at the wall clock that showed almost midnight, and felt a pang of apprehension tighten his stomach. Who could be knocking at his door at this hour, in the middle of such a storm? David wiped his greasy hands on his worn jeans and walked slowly to the gate, each step echoing in the heavy silence of the shed. He placed his hand on the latch, took a deep breath, and pulled the heavy metal door that creaked on its tracks. "Who's there?" he shouted, struggling to be heard above the roar of the wind. The scene that revealed itself before his eyes left him momentarily paralyzed. On the other side of the gate, soaked to the bone and shaking violently under the torrential rain, was an elderly man David had never seen before. The old man must have been around 70 years old, with a face marked by deep wrinkles that looked like furrows carved by time. His clothes were old and patched, clinging to his thin body like a wet second skin, and his white hair was stuck to his wrinkled forehead. But what caught David's attention the most was the child the old man was firmly holding by the hand. A small boy, who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with a pale face and half-closed eyes, was dangerously swaying on trembling legs. The child was soaked like the old man, but there was something else that made him tremble in that uncontrolled way. David immediately realized that the boy had a high fever, very high. "Please, sir," said the old man, his weak and desperate voice coming out between trembling lips as water ran down his face. "We just need a place to spend the night, I beg you." David looked from the old man's pleading eyes to the boy's feverish face and felt his heart tighten in his chest. He knew he should send them both away, that he already had enough problems to solve. But when his eyes met the child's, seeing there the same lost look that his own daughter had when she was sick, David simply couldn't say no. It was as if that childish look had pierced through all the layers of bitterness he had built around himself, reaching the part of him that still believed in doing good. He moved away from the gate and nodded, indicating for them to enter. "Come in quickly," he said, his voice coming out gentler than he expected, and the old man muttered an almost inaudible thank you as he practically carried the boy inside. David closed the gate, locking it, and the metallic sound of the latch echoed through the space. The rainwater that dripped from the two formed puddles on the concrete floor, and the sound of the child's labored breathing echoed through the empty space. David observed the boy more closely now, under the weak light of the lamp, and realized that the situation was serious. The child's skin was pale, almost translucent, with red patches on his cheeks that betrayed the high fever, and his lips had a bluish tinge. The boy could barely keep his eyes open, and his limbs hung loosely, as if he had no strength to stand up. "The boy is very sick," said David, watching the child shiver. "He needs a doctor." The old man shook his head sadly, holding the boy closer to himself, and tears mixed with the rainwater on his face. He could barely keep his eyes open from exhaustion, and his legs trembled under the child's weight. "I don't have money for a doctor, sir," said the old man, his voice laden with shame. "We just need to stay here until the storm passes. I swear we won't bother you." David ran his hand through his hair and nodded. "You can stay," he replied, feeling the weight of that decision. "And I have some medicine here. Maybe it can help." He guided the two to a more protected area at the back of the workshop, where there were some old cloth sacks that he used to clean parts. David took the sacks and shook them vigorously, trying to remove as much dirt as possible, before spreading them on the floor to form a relatively soft surface. The boy was trembling so violently that his teeth were chattering against each other, producing a sound that sent chills down the spine. The old man laid the child on the cloths with extreme care, caressing the little one's wet hair and whispering words of comfort that David couldn't quite hear. "Wait here," said David, his voice coming out firmer now that he had something practical to do. "I'll get blankets and something for that fever." He crossed the workshop with quick steps, feeling for the first time in months a strange sensation that took a few seconds to identify as purpose. He climbed the narrow staircase that led to the small apartment he had built above the workshop years ago, when business was good. The apartment was tiny, just a bedroom, a kitchen, and a cramped bathroom, but it had been his home for the last few months. David opened the small medicine cabinet in the bathroom, rummaging through the old boxes until he found what he was looking for. "Here it is," he muttered upon finding a box of fever medicine that had been left over from the last time his daughter was sick. He also took 2 old blankets that were folded in the bedroom closet, a little moldy from time, but still usable. When David came back down to the workshop, carrying the blankets and the medicine box, he found the old man sitting on the floor next to the boy, caressing the child's feverish forehead with touching tenderness. "I brought this," said David, approaching and extending the blankets to the elderly man, who accepted them with a look of deep gratitude. "And I have medicine for fever here," he continued, opening the box and reading the instructions, trying to remember the correct dosage. "It's safe for children. I used to give it to my daughter." The old man took the blankets with trembling hands and began to wrap the boy in them, creating a protective cocoon around the small body. David knelt beside them, opening the blister pack and carefully removing one pill. "Can the boy swallow?" he asked, looking at the elderly man, who nodded yes. David picked up a bottle of water that was on the nearby counter, opened it, and placed the pill in his palm. "Here we go, champ," he said softly, using the same tone he used to use with his daughter, and helped the boy sit up a bit. The boy briefly opened his eyes, his gaze unfocused from the fever, and David placed the pill in his mouth, followed by a sip of water. "That's it. Swallow slowly," he encouraged, and the boy obeyed, swallowing with difficulty. "Very good," said David, laying the boy back down on the blankets. The old man held David's hand with surprising strength, his bony fingers squeezing as if holding onto a lifeline. "God bless you, sir," said the old man, his voice choked with emotion and eyes shining with tears. "You don't know what this kindness means to us." David felt his own chest tighten, no longer accustomed to gestures of gratitude after so much time living in isolation. He gave an awkward pat on the old man's shoulder and stood up, wiping his hands on his pants. "It's nothing," he replied, although they both knew that wasn't true. "The medicine should take effect in about 20 minutes and the fever will start to go down," David continued, trying to maintain a practical tone. "You rest now. I'll be upstairs. If you need anything, just shout." David pointed to the stairs leading to his apartment, and the old man nodded, lying down next to the boy. The rain continued falling outside, but inside the workshop there was now a sense of peace that contrasted with the chaos of the storm. "Good night," he finally said, and then turned and walked toward the stairs. When David reached the top and entered the apartment, he closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, breathing deeply. He looked around the small, messy space, seeing clothes thrown over the chair, the sink full of dirty dishes, the unmade bed in the corner. David took off his grease-stained shirt and went to the sink, washed his face with cold water, observing his reflection in the stained mirror. He saw a man he barely recognized, with deep, dark circles, disheveled hair, and a permanent expression of fatigue. "At least I did one thing right today," he muttered, then dried his face and headed to bed. He lay down on the thin mattress without removing his pants, feeling every muscle ache with tiredness, but at the same time his mind was alert, processing the events of the night. David looked at the cracked ceiling, listening to the sound of the rain that was beginning to diminish, and thought of his daughter, wondering if she was okay, if she sometimes thought of him. She must be sleeping now, he thought, imagining the girl protected from the storm. The image of the sick boy downstairs overlapped with that of his daughter, and David felt a pang of pain. "Tomorrow I'll see what I can do for them," he decided, closing his eyes and letting fatigue begin to overcome him. Downstairs, in the workshop shrouded in dim light, the elderly man had finally fallen asleep, too exhausted to resist sleep. His soft, irregular snoring echoed quietly through the space, mixing with the decreasing sound of the rain. Beside him, wrapped in the old blankets, the boy Michael began to feel the effects of the medicine. His breathing, which before was labored, slowly began to normalize, and the rigidity caused by chills gave way to relaxation. But with the relief from fever also came a return of consciousness, and the child's eyes opened slowly in the darkness, still half closed but more alert. Michael lay for a few minutes, looking around and trying to remember where he was, his mind still foggy, processing the dark shapes of the machines around him. Then he turned his head and saw the familiar form of his grandfather sleeping, and that brought comfort. The child remained motionless for some time, listening to the old man's snoring and the soft sound of the rain, so different from the terrifying roar before. Michael felt better. The fever had dropped enough that his head was no longer spinning, although he still felt weakness. He looked around the workshop with growing curiosity, his child's eyes naturally drawn to the shapes of machines and tools he had never seen before. There was something fascinating about that place, with its smells of grease and metal, its deep shadows and mysterious corners. Michael felt the urge to explore, to get up and take a look around, but he hesitated, looking at his sleeping grandfather. "He's so tired," the boy thought, remembering how the old man had carried him in the rain, and decided not to disturb him. Slowly and carefully, to avoid making noise, Michael disentangled himself from the blankets and sat up, waiting to see if the dizziness would return, but he felt relatively stable. He looked again at his grandfather, who was still sleeping deeply, and then carefully stood up, supporting himself against the wall. The cold floor was freezing under his bare feet, making him take small hops, and he had to squint to see in the dim light. The only light came from a distant lamp, creating a pale cone that barely reached where they were. Michael began to walk slowly among the machines, his little hands touching the cold surfaces, feeling the textures of the rusty metal. What a cool place, he thought, his eyes shining with fascination for everything that was new. It was when he was exploring the back of the workshop, where the shadows were densest, that Michael spotted something that captured all his attention. Leaning against the back wall, partially covered by an old canvas, was an old car that clearly hadn't moved from there in a long time. The vehicle was in terrible condition, with peeling paint, flat tires, and windows covered with dirt. But for an 8-year-old child, it was a treasure, an exciting discovery. Michael approached the car with careful steps, his heart beating faster, and reached out to touch the cold bodywork. "It's a real car," he murmured, amazed, and began to walk around it, observing every detail. The boy stopped beside the car and knelt down, trying to peek under the chassis in the darkness. There was something mysterious about that dark space, as if it were a secret cave. Michael looked around and spotted a small flashlight on a nearby workbench. His eyes lit up, and he quickly grabbed the flashlight, pressing the button and feeling satisfaction when the yellowish light sprouted. "Perfect," he thought, smiling for the first time in days, and went back to the car, kneeling down and pointing the flashlight underneath the vehicle. The light revealed a world of shadows and metallic shapes, hanging tubes and cables, and the boy felt the desire to go in there and explore. "Just a quick look," he said to himself. Michael lay down on the cold floor, feeling the dirt stick to his clothes but not caring. He began to crawl under the car, pushing the flashlight ahead and illuminating his path. It was like entering another world, where everything seemed bigger and more impressive. The boy moved the flashlight from side to side, observing the engine parts, rusty tubes, and all the mysterious components. He was so absorbed that he didn't notice how far he had crawled, until suddenly the light illuminated something different. Attached with old tape to the underside of the chassis, almost hidden among the components, was a small metal box wrapped in plastic that seemed to have been placed there to be hidden. "What is this?" whispered Michael, his voice sounding loud in the confined space. Curiosity overcame any hesitation, and he reached out to touch the box, feeling the cold surface of the metal through the plastic. The tape was old and had lost its adhesion, so when Michael pulled slightly, the box came loose easily, almost making him lose his balance. He held the object against his chest and began to crawl back, his heart beating rapidly. When he finally emerged from under the car, covered in dirt and with cobwebs in his hair, Michael sat down and placed the box in his lap, illuminating it to examine it better. The box was small, the size of a child's shoebox, made of grey metal that was peeling, revealing rust. The plastic was yellowed, but relatively intact. "Grandpa will want to see this," thought Michael, and in the excitement of showing his discovery, he completely forgot to be silent. The boy got up too quickly, still holding the box and the flashlight, and in the process bumped into a pile of tools that were leaning against the workbench. The noise was deafening in the quietness of the night, with wrenches and hammers cascading onto the floor, creating a metallic crash that echoed throughout the workshop. Michael let out a high-pitched cry of fright, dropping the flashlight, which rolled across the floor, randomly illuminating things. "Grandpa!" he shouted instinctively, frightened by the noise, his voice echoing and certainly loud enough to wake not only the old man, but David as well. The boy stood paralyzed, still clutching the box against his chest, eyes wide with fear, waiting for the reaction. His heart was beating so hard he could hear it in his own ears, and suddenly the fever and weakness seemed to return, making his legs tremble. "I didn't mean to make noise," he said, his voice now small and frightened in the darkness. The boy's shrill scream cut through the dawn silence like a sharp blade, echoing off the walls of the workshop and climbing up the stairs that led to the small apartment where David had just closed his eyes. The metallic crash of tools falling to the floor reverberated throughout the space, creating a deafening alarm that tore the old man from his deep sleep. Thomas opened his eyes suddenly, disoriented and frightened, taking a few seconds to remember where he was. He sat up quickly, ignoring the pain in his back, and looked around, searching for the boy. The place where Michael had been lying was empty. Only the rumpled blankets indicated that the child had been there moments before. "Michael!" shouted the old man, feeling panic tighten his chest as he tried to get up. "Where are you, boy?" The frightened voice of his grandson came from the back of the workshop near the old car. Thomas forced his legs to move faster, stumbling between machines toward the source of the voice. When he finally got close to the abandoned vehicle, he found Michael standing next to it, covered in dirt from head to toe, with cobwebs stuck in his hair, holding a rusty metal box against his chest. The flashlight that had fallen to the floor remained lit, rolling and projecting dancing shadows on the walls. The boy had eyes wide with fright, and his hands were visibly shaking. "Grandpa, I found this under the car," said Michael, his voice coming out in a frightened whisper as he pointed underneath the vehicle. "It was hidden down there." Thomas felt something strange tighten in his stomach. The old man knelt beside his grandson and took the box from the child's trembling hands to examine it. The box was made of metal, painted grey, with peeling paint revealing rust spots, wrapped in yellowed plastic. There was old adhesive tape stuck to one side. Thomas shook the box slightly and heard the sound of objects moving inside. He looked at Michael, who was watching him with curiosity mixed with fear. "This isn't ours, boy," said the old man. But even as he spoke, he knew curiosity had already won. "Maybe we should leave it alone." Michael shook his head vigorously, his eyes shining. "But Grandpa, you need to see what's inside," insisted the boy. "It could be something important." Thomas removed the plastic wrapping the box and it gave way easily, tearing in some places. When the plastic was completely removed, the old man looked for a way to open it, finding a lid secured by rusty side latches. He forced the latches with his thumbs, and they yielded with a metallic click. The old man's heart was beating faster now. He raised the lid slowly, and both he and Michael leaned forward at the same time. What they saw left them temporarily speechless. Inside the box, carefully organized, were bundles of money with bank wrappers, folded official-looking contracts, and a stack of receipts and documents. "My God in heaven," whispered Thomas, feeling his hands tremble. "That's a lot of money, Michael." The boy just nodded, his eyes wide at the sight of all those bills. The old man carefully picked up one of the contracts, unfolding it and bringing the paper close to his eyes. He had to squint to read, and when he finally managed to see the words, he felt his stomach turn. The contract was for the sale of automotive parts, but there was something strange, numbers that didn't add up, inflated values. But what really caught his attention was the name written prominently at the top of the document. Eleanor, it said there in clear letters, followed by a full surname and a firm signature at the bottom. "Eleanor," muttered the old man to himself, frowning. "This name is everywhere on these papers." Michael was picking up the receipts one by one, looking at them with curiosity, even without fully understanding. Thomas picked up more documents, and the more he read, the more his concern grew. "This isn't right, Michael," he said. "These hidden things, this money, this doesn't seem good to me at all." It was at that moment they heard quick footsteps coming down the metal stairs. The sound echoed through the workshop, and both Thomas and Michael turned their heads simultaneously, their bodies tensing. David appeared at the foot of the stairs wearing only pajama pants and a t-shirt, his hair disheveled and his eyes half closed with sleep, but quickly opening. He had woken up with the crash of tools and the boy's scream, and rushed downstairs thinking something terrible was happening. But what he found was something completely different. "What's going on here?" asked David, his voice coming out louder than he intended. "What are you two doing back there?" Thomas tried to stand up quickly and almost lost his balance, supporting himself on the car. The box he was holding became fully visible to David, who narrowed his eyes. "Sir, please let me explain," Thomas began, his voice trembling. "The boy didn't mean to do anything wrong. He was just curious and happened to find this under your car." David walked toward them with firm steps, navigating around the scattered tools, and the closer he got, the more his expression changed from confusion to something darker. Michael instinctively stepped back and hid behind his grandfather. "What is that you're holding?" asked David, pointing to the box with an abrupt gesture. "Where did you get this from?" Thomas extended the box toward David with trembling hands. The mechanic took the box roughly and looked inside with an expression that began as curiosity, but quickly transformed into something disturbing. His eyes widened as he saw the bundles of money, the contracts, The receipts. David picked up one of the bundles with shaking fingers, turning it from side to side. Where did this come from? He muttered, more to himself. How did this end up under the car? David's mind was working at maximum speed, trying to process the discovery. His first thought was that he was being robbed. Perhaps these two weren't what they seemed. Maybe this whole story was a ruse to get into the workshop. But at the same time, a more rational part argued that it didn't make sense, that if they wanted to steal, they would have already left. David looked from the money to the old man, and then to the boy who was hiding behind his grandfather, and felt anger and mistrust fighting against something softer inside him. "Were you trying to steal this?" he asked, his voice harsh. "Is that why you asked for shelter, so you could go through my things while I slept?" Thomas shook his head vigorously, his hands raised in surrender. "No, sir. I swear that wasn't our intention," said the old man, desperate. "I was asleep, too exhausted to do anything," he pointed to Michael. "It was the boy who found it. He woke up feeling better and was curious about the car. You know how children are." David looked at the boy, seeing the tears and genuine fear in his eyes, and felt something waver for a moment. But then his gaze returned to the box, to all that money and those documents he had never seen, and the mistrust came back, full force. "I don't believe you," said David, his voice cold. "I opened my door in the middle of a storm, gave medicine to the sick boy, offered blankets, and you repay me by going through my things?" Thomas felt tears beginning to burn his eyes, a mixture of frustration and despair. He had spent the night carrying a sick boy through the storm, knocking on door after door, until finally finding someone with compassion. And now, because of a discovery they couldn't have predicted, they were being accused of theft. "Mr. David, please, you have to believe me," the old man pleaded, clasping his hands. "We're not thieves, we're just humble people trying to survive." He pulled Michael close, embracing the boy's trembling shoulders. "Look at us, we're covered in dirt, haven't eaten in days, we just needed help." David looked at the two, seeing the genuine misery, but the anger and humiliation he felt were too strong. "I don't want to hear excuses," he said, his voice getting louder as he pointed to the door. "You came into my property, went through my things without permission, and now you want me to believe it was all an accident." He shook the box in the air, making the papers rattle. "This was hidden for a reason, and you had no right to touch it." Thomas tried to take another step forward to explain, but David raised his hand in a gesture that meant silence. The mechanic walked to the workshop gate, still holding the box, and unlocked the heavy metal door. The rain outside had almost completely stopped, leaving only a fine drizzle, and the sky was beginning to clear with the first signs of dawn. "Get out," ordered David, opening the gate. "Get out of my workshop now before I call the police." Michael began to cry openly, sobbing as he clung to his grandfather's hand, and even Thomas felt tears rolling down his face. He had no strength to argue anymore, no energy to continue begging. The old man picked up Michael in his arms, even knowing his back would hurt afterward, and walked toward the open door with slow steps. When he passed David, he stopped for a moment and looked into the mechanic's eyes, seeing there not just anger but also pain and confusion. "God bless you, sir," said Thomas, his voice choked but still carrying dignity. "And may he help you find peace with whatever is hidden in that box." David looked away, unable to bear the weight of those eyes full of disappointment. As soon as the two were outside stepping on the cold mud, David pushed the gate forcefully, closing it with a bang. He locked the door, rested his forehead against the cold metal, and felt his whole body tremble. "They deserved it," he muttered to himself. "They had no right to mess with my things." But even saying this, he knew the words sounded empty. David walked back to the center of the workshop, still holding the box against his chest. He passed by scattered tools, crumpled blankets, and felt a pang of something that could be regret, trying to penetrate his armor of anger. The mechanic placed the box on the main workbench, under the bright light of the lamp, and stared at it for a long moment before examining its contents. His hands trembled as he picked up the bundles of money, mentally counting and realizing there was a considerable amount, more money than he had seen together in a long time. "Where did this come from?" he asked aloud. "And why was it hidden under the car?" The questions remained unanswered. He put the money aside and took the contracts, beginning to examine them one by one. The papers seemed relatively recent, despite the rusty box. David unfolded the first contract, his eyes scanning the lines. It was a parts sales contract detailing a transaction involving expensive components that he recognized. Everything seemed normal until he reached the signatures. There, written in a handwriting he would recognize anywhere, was the name that made his heart stop. "Eleanor," he read aloud, his voice sounding strange. "My Eleanor signed this?" David dropped that contract and picked up another with trembling hands, and then another and another. All the documents had his wife's name connected to the transactions. Sometimes she appeared as the seller, other times as an intermediary, and in some cases as the person responsible for receiving payments. But what made his stomach turn was realizing that the numbers didn't add up, that there were obvious discrepancies between the values declared in the contracts and the values on the receipts. Some parts were sold for one price in the official documents, but the receipts showed much larger amounts being paid under the table. "This can't be right," he said, feeling the room spin and having to lean on the bench for support. "This can't be true." But the documents told a different story. He continued examining the papers with growing horror, finding evidence that his wife had been involved in something wrong. Eleanor had always offered to handle the paperwork, the sales, the contracts, and David had let her take on that responsibility because he preferred the practical work. He had trusted her completely, never questioning her methods or checking the numbers carefully. "She was stealing," he murmured. "She was diverting money from sales, falsifying values, and keeping it all for herself." David dropped the papers on the bench and brought his hands to his face, rubbing his eyes as if he could erase what he had just discovered. His mind was racing, processing information, making connections he should have made a long time ago. He remembered how Eleanor always insisted on going to the bank personally, how she kept the books locked in a drawer to which only she had the key, how she became defensive when he asked about finances. "I was an idiot," he said, his voice laden with bitterness. "A blind idiot who trusted too much and asked too little." He thought of all the years of hard work, all the overtime he put in while Eleanor supposedly handled the administrative side, and now he discovered that she had been betraying him. The receipts showed transactions he didn't remember authorizing, sales of valuable parts that should have been in inventory, payments that never appeared in the official books. There was a clear pattern of systematic diversion of resources. "That's why we started having financial problems," he suddenly realized. "It wasn't because business was bad, it was because she was diverting the money all along." David held one of the contracts tightly, the paper crumpling between his fingers. This was the woman he had loved, with whom he had built a life, with whom he had made a daughter. This was the person who slept by his side every night, who knew all his fears and hopes, who had promised to be with him in joy and in sorrow. "How could she do this to me?" he asked the emptiness, his voice breaking. "How could she look into my eyes every day, knowing what she was doing behind my back?" The questions remained unanswered, echoing through the workshop. He stood there alone, surrounded by evidence of the betrayal of someone he had loved and trusted above all else. The name Eleanor on the documents seemed to burn his eyes each time he looked, and David felt something inside him break definitively. "The woman who slept by my side was lying," he whispered to himself, the realization solidifying as an inescapable truth. "She was stealing from me, betraying me, deceiving me all this time." The pain was so intense that he could barely breathe. The morning arrived grey and cold, with the sun struggling to penetrate the heavy clouds that still covered the sky after the previous night's storm. David hadn't slept a single minute since he had thrown the old man and the boy out of the workshop. He had spent the remaining hours of dawn sitting at the workbench, repeatedly examining the documents from the metal box, trying to find some alternative explanation that made sense, some way to interpret those papers that didn't lead to the obvious and painful conclusion that his wife had betrayed him. His eyes were red and burning with fatigue, and his head throbbed with a dull pain that refused to pass. But none of this mattered compared to the pain he felt in his chest, a crushing weight that made it difficult to breathe. He looked at the clock on the wall and saw that it was already past 7 in the morning. Eleanor always arrived early on Thursdays to resolve administrative matters that still remained from the workshop, even after leaving him. "She'll show up at any moment," David muttered to himself, feeling his stomach turn with anticipation and fear. "And I'll have to face her knowing what I know now." The sound of a key turning in the lock of the side door of the workshop cut through the heavy silence, making David stiffen in the chair where he was sitting. He heard familiar female footsteps crossing the small corridor that connected the side entrance to the administrative area of the workshop, and then Eleanor appeared, carrying her large bag on her shoulder and holding a disposable coffee cup in her other hand. She was dressed in jeans and a simple blouse, her hair tied in a careless ponytail, and when she saw David sitting there in the middle of the workshop surrounded by scattered papers, her expression changed from neutral to slightly surprised. "David," she said, stopping at the entrance and looking around with an arched eyebrow, "did you spend the night here?" He just nodded, unable to trust his voice at that moment. Eleanor sighed and walked to the improvised kitchenette they had set up in a corner of the workshop, placing her bag on the counter and beginning to prepare a coffee maker as she did every Thursday when she came to handle paperwork. "You need to stop doing this to yourself," she continued without looking at him, her voice carrying that tone of slight irritation mixed with feigned concern that David knew so well. "Sleeping here won't make the situation better or the eviction disappear." David observed Eleanor move around the kitchenette with automatic and familiar movements, taking the coffee grounds, filling the water reservoir, turning on the machine as if this were just another normal day. She seemed so calm, so at ease, so completely oblivious to the fact that his world had completely collapsed during the night. Or perhaps she knew exactly what she was doing. Perhaps all that normality was just another layer of lies on top of all the others she had told over the years. "Eleanor," David finally said, his voice coming out hoarse and rough from so much time without using it, "I need to talk to you about something." She turned her head toward him, leaning on the counter while waiting for the coffee maker to finish its work. "About the eviction?" she asked, and there was something in her tone that David couldn't completely identify. "Because if that's it, I've already told you that there's nothing more I can do, David. You let things go too far." He shook his head slowly, feeling anger beginning to bubble inside him, mixed with pain. "It's not about the eviction," he replied, and his hands closed into fists on his knees. "It's about something I found last night." Eleanor looked away from him and turned her attention back to the coffee maker, which was beginning to drip the dark liquid into the glass container. There was something in her body language that changed subtly, an almost imperceptible tension that entered her shoulders, but her voice came out casual when she spoke. "Found what?" she asked, taking 2 cups from the cabinet above the sink. "More bills you can't pay?" David rose from the chair with a sudden movement that made his sore muscles protest and walked to the counter where he had left the metal box. He picked it up with both hands, feeling the familiar weight now laden with terrible significance, and walked toward the kitchenette where Eleanor was still with her back to him. "I found this," he said, placing the box forcefully on the counter beside her, making a noise that finally made her turn and look. It was hidden underneath an old car at the back of the workshop. Eleanor looked at the box with an expression that began as genuine confusion, but David was watching carefully now, looking for any sign of recognition or guilt. "A rusty box?" she said, frowning. "And what's so important about that?" David opened the lid of the box with a deliberate movement, revealing the contents that had kept him awake all night. Eleanor looked inside, and this time her reaction was more obvious, her eyes widening at the sight of the bundles of money and documents organized there. "My God," she murmured, and her hand flew to her mouth in a gesture of surprise. "Where did all this money come from?" David picked up one of the contracts he had marked earlier, the one with the most obvious discrepancies in values and with her signature clearly visible at the bottom. He unfolded the paper and placed it in front of her on the counter, his finger pointing to the name written there. "This was hidden under a car," he said, his voice trembling with contained emotion. "And your name is here, Eleanor. It's on all of these documents." She picked up the paper with hands that began to visibly tremble, her eyes scanning the printed lines with a speed that seemed almost desperate. David watched her face go through a series of expressions, starting with confusion, then moving to something that seemed like recognition, and finally settling on shock and indignation. "My name," she said, her voice rising an octave. "That's completely absurd." Eleanor dropped the contract back on the counter, as if the paper burned her hands and brought both hands to her head in a dramatic gesture of disbelief. She started pacing back and forth in the small space of the kitchenette, her breathing becoming faster and shallower, and David could see that she was building a performance. "David, you can't be serious," she said, turning to face him with wide eyes. "You really think I would be capable of something like this?" She pointed to the box with an accusatory gesture. "Of hiding money and forging documents?" David felt something inside him falter. That part of him that still wanted to believe, that still loved the woman he thought he knew. But he forced himself to remain firm, to not let years of emotional manipulation make him ignore concrete evidence. "The documents have your signature, Eleanor," he said, taking more papers from the box and spreading them on the counter. "All of them, every suspicious transaction, every discrepancy in values, they all have your name." She shook her head violently, and David noticed that tears were starting to form in her eyes. "No, no, no," she murmured, bringing her hand to her forehead in a gesture that seemed on the verge of fainting. "This can't be happening." Eleanor leaned on the counter as if her legs could no longer support her, and David took a step forward instinctively, his body responding to years of conditioning to protect and support her, even when his mind screamed that it was all a farce. "David," she said, her voice coming out weak and broken, "do you really think I would be capable of doing something like this to you, to our family?" She looked at him with eyes shining with unshed tears, and her expression was one of pure pain and betrayal. "After everything we've built together, after all the years we've worked side by side in this workshop." David felt his stomach tighten with guilt, exactly as she intended him to feel. But then he thought about the numbers that didn't add up, the diverted money, the years of lies, and forced himself not to give in. "Then explain it to me," he said, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. "Explain to me why your signature is on all these fraudulent documents, why this money was hidden in my workshop." Eleanor wiped her eyes with the backs of her hands, a gesture that seemed simultaneously genuine and calculated. "I can explain," she said, her voice taking on a tone of desperate urgency. "But you need to listen to me with an open mind. You need to trust me." David crossed his arms over his chest, creating a physical barrier between them, but nodded for her to continue. Eleanor took several deep breaths as if gathering courage, and then began to speak in a voice that sounded sincere. "Do you remember the secretary we hired a few years ago?" she asked, and David frowned, trying to remember. "That young woman who came 3 times a week to help with the paperwork?" He nodded yes, vaguely remembering a woman in her 20s who had worked for them for a while before leaving without notice. "She was always going through old documents from the shop," Eleanor continued, her voice taking on an accusatory tone. "I always warned you not to trust her completely. Always said there was something strange about that girl." David felt the first crack in his certainty, a small doubt beginning to infiltrate. Could it be possible that he was blaming the wrong person? "Are you saying she forged these documents?" Teo, he asked, though the logic of this explanation seemed fragile. "And put your name on them?" Eleanor nodded vigorously, clinging to that narrative like a lifeline. "Yes, exactly that," she said, her voice becoming more animated now that she saw an opening. "She had access to all the files, knew my signature from seeing it so often on legitimate documents." David looked at the papers spread across the counter, trying to process this new information and decide if it made any sense. Part of him wanted to believe, desperately wanted there to be an explanation that didn't involve the woman he loved being a liar and a thief. "But what about the money?" he asked, pointing to the bundles still visible inside the box. "How do you explain all this hidden money?" Eleanor bit her lower lip, an expression of hesitation crossing her face, as if she were internally debating whether she should reveal something. "David," she finally said, taking a step toward him, "I need to confess something, but you have to promise you won't get mad at me." He felt his stomach tighten again, not knowing if he was about to hear the truth or just another layer of lies. "What thing?" he asked, his voice cautious. Eleanor wiped away more tears and looked at him with a studied expression of vulnerability. "I just wanted to help you, love," she said, her voice breaking. "When I saw that the shop was starting to have financial problems, I tried to make some payments using my own name to protect the company's name." David felt his head start to spin with this new information, trying to fit it with everything else he had discovered. "You made payments in your name?" he repeated, confused. "Why?" Eleanor took another step toward him, reducing the space between them, and her expression was one of pure sincerity. "Because I didn't want suppliers to know that the shop was having difficulties," she explained, the words coming out quickly now, as if she had rehearsed this many times. "I thought if I made the transactions in my personal name, it would keep the company's reputation intact, while you solved the problems." David wanted so badly to believe that that beautiful and noble explanation was true. "But that doesn't explain the discrepancies in the amounts," he said, although his voice was already beginning to lose some of its previous certainty. "Nor does it explain why everything was hidden." Eleanor shook her head sadly, as if she were dealing with a child who couldn't understand something simple. "The secretary must have taken advantage of this situation to involve me in something wrong," she said, and her voice was laden with hurt. "She knew I was making transactions in my name, so she took the opportunity to forge other documents and make it look like I was embezzling money." David looked into Eleanor's eyes, searching for some sign of a lie, some evidence that she was constructing an elaborate story to get rid of guilt. But she held his gaze without wavering, and her tears seemed genuine and her voice carried conviction. "You know how envious people are, David," she continued, taking another step and now being close enough to touch his arm. "Especially when they see a woman in a position of responsibility in a business." She gently squeezed his arm, her touch familiar and manipulative at the same time. "She probably thought she could incriminate me and then blackmail us, or maybe steal the money and put the blame on me." David felt his defenses beginning to crumble. Years of love and trust fighting against the evidence he had seen with his own eyes. Eleanor saw the hesitation in his expression and seized the moment, placing both hands on his arms and looking directly into his eyes. "David, I am your wife," she said, her voice becoming softer and more intimate. "We built a life together. We have a daughter together." A solitary tear rolled down her face. "Trust me, please, I would never do anything to hurt you or harm our family." David felt something inside him completely give way under the weight of those words and that look. Under years of emotional conditioning and under his own desperate desire not to be facing the reality that everything in his life had been a lie. He placed his hands over hers, where they still rested on his arms, and felt tears beginning to burn his own eyes. "Eleanor," he said, his voice breaking with emotion, "I want to believe you. I need to believe you." She gave a small trembling smile as if relieved and moved even closer. "Then believe me," she whispered, "because I'm telling you the truth. I swear on our daughter that I'm telling you the truth." David closed his eyes, trying to block the annoying voice in his head that screamed that something still didn't make sense, that the pieces didn't fit quite right. "But the money," he insisted one last time, though his voice no longer had any strength. "Why was the money hidden under the car?" Eleanor wiped her own eyes and then reached to wipe his tears as well, her touch gentle and familiar. "I don't know, love," she said, and her voice sounded sincere. "Maybe the secretary hid it there, or maybe someone she was involved with. I really don't know." David opened his eyes and looked at the woman before him, seeing in her both the person he loved and a stranger he might have never really known. But in the end, love won over reason, as Eleanor knew it would. "All right," he finally said, his voice coming out defeated. "I believe you." Eleanor let out a sigh of relief that seemed genuine and immediately pulled him into a tight hug, pressing her face against his chest. "Thank you," she murmured against his shirt. "Thank you for trusting me. I know things are difficult, but I would never betray you." David hugged her back, but there was a part of him that remained distant, observing everything with growing skepticism. She pulled away a little and took his hands, bringing them to her lips and kissing them with exaggerated tenderness. "We'll get through this," she said, looking into his eyes. "We'll find out who's really behind all this, and we'll clear my name." He merely nodded, not trusting his voice to say anything more. Eleanor kissed him softly on the lips, a kiss that seemed to be both comforting and possessive. "I need to go now," she said, looking at her watch. "But I'll be back later and we'll figure this out together, okay?" David nodded again, feeling strangely empty and exhausted. Eleanor picked up her purse from the counter, quickly checked her appearance in the small mirror she kept inside, and then went back to David for one more quick hug. "Love you," she said, the words coming out automatic and practiced. Don't worry about this anymore. Everything will be fine." David watched her walk toward the side door, her steps light and carefree now that she had successfully navigated the situation. But what he didn't see, what he couldn't have seen from that angle, was the expression on Eleanor's face as soon as she turned her back to him. The smile instantly disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. "Idiot," she whispered to herself, so low that David couldn't hear. Always so easy to manipulate. She opened the door and left, leaving David alone once more with his confused thoughts and his unresolved pain. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the closed door, feeling that something inside him was broken in a way that perhaps could never be fixed. "I want to believe her," he murmured to the empty workshop. "But why does it still hurt so much?" Outside the workshop, hidden behind a pile of discarded materials near the side window, Thomas watched everything with an expression of profound sadness and understanding. He had come back after spending the night in a precarious shelter, bringing Michael back to try to talk to David in daylight and better explain what had happened. But when they arrived and saw through the window the scene that was unfolding inside, the old man decided to stay quiet and just observe. He had seen everything, from the moment David showed the documents to Eleanor's final manipulative embrace. Michael was at his side, holding his hand and looking confusedly at his grandfather. "Grandpa, why was that lady crying?" whispered the boy, and Thomas sadly shook his head. "She wasn't really crying, my son," replied the old man, his voice laden with bitter wisdom acquired through many years of seeing human nature at its worst. "She was pretending to deceive that good man." Michael frowned, not fully understanding. "But why?" he asked. Thomas sighed deeply. "Poor man," he muttered, more to himself than to the boy. "Love blinds even the most righteous." Eleanor walked to her car parked across the street, her heels making a rhythmic sound on the asphalt still wet from the previous night's rain. She opened the door, got in, and sat there for a moment before starting the engine, staring fixedly at the workshop through the windshield. Her face was completely different now. All the tears and all the vulnerability had completely disappeared, replaced by a hard and determined expression. She thought about David in there, probably still wrestling with doubts and trying to convince himself that he had made the right decision by believing her. "Weak," she said aloud to the empty interior of the car, and her voice was laden with contempt. "Always too weak to do what needs to be done." She took the phone from her purse and typed a quick message to someone, her fingers flying over the screen with practice. After sending it, she looked once more at the workshop, and a cold, humorless smile curved her lips. "Nobody will take away what's mine," she whispered to herself, her words carrying a promise and a threat. Absolutely nobody. The days that followed the confrontation at the workshop were marked by a heavy, uncomfortable silence that hung over David like a dark cloud. He had said he believed Eleanor, had hugged her and promised they would solve everything together, but something inside him had changed irrevocably that day. Every time she appeared at the workshop to sort out paperwork or check some document, David found excuses to leave, to work in another area, to avoid being alone with her for too long. He answered her questions with monosyllables, kept conversations short and superficial, and never again looked directly into her eyes for fear of what he might see there. Eleanor noticed the change immediately, of course, because she was always too observant and calculating to let something like that pass. At first, she tried to address the issue directly, asking if he was okay, if he was still upset about the document situation, if there was something she could do to help. But David simply shook his head and said he was just tired, just worried about the impending eviction, just trying to figure out how to save what remained of his life. "It's all right, Eleanor," he lied, unable to completely hide the coldness in his voice. "I just need time to process all this." She bit her lip and nodded, but her eyes revealed she didn't believe him. The tension between them grew with each passing day, becoming something almost palpable whenever they were in the same environment. Eleanor began to realize that David was not only avoiding her physically, but also emotionally, erecting invisible walls that she couldn't penetrate no matter how hard she tried. She saw the way he pulled away when she got too close, how he averted his gaze when she tried to establish eye contact, how his responses became increasingly short and evasive. Fear began to grow inside her, a visceral fear that she was losing control of the situation, that David was beginning to see through her lies, despite all her efforts to keep him manipulated and under control. And this fear, as often happens, slowly began to transform into something darker and more dangerous. Anger began to bubble beneath the surface of her carefully constructed mask. An anger directed at David for daring to doubt her, for not being as easily controlled as she needed him to be. "He's going to expose me," she thought as she watched David work from a distance. "He'll discover everything and denounce me, and I'll lose everything I've built." Paranoia mixed with anger, creating a toxic cocktail of emotions. It was a Thursday night, almost 2 weeks after the discovery of the box, when Eleanor arrived at the workshop later than usual. She had called earlier, saying she needed to pick up some important documents she had forgotten at her old desk in the workshop office, and David had said it was no problem, that he would be working late anyway, finishing repairs on a customer's car that needed to be ready by the next day. When Eleanor entered through the side door, she found the workshop immersed in shadows, except for the work area where David was bent over an open car hood, his greasy hands methodically working on some engine component. He barely lifted his head when he heard her footsteps, just muttering a brief greeting before turning his attention back to his work. Eleanor stood there for a moment, watching him work, and felt the anger pulse stronger in her chest. "David," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral, "you're not even going to greet me properly?" He sighed and finally raised his eyes, but his gaze was distant and tired. "Hi, Eleanor," he said without emotion. "The documents are where they always are. You can take them." She clenched her fists at her sides, feeling the rejection like a slap in the face. Eleanor walked to the small office at the back of the workshop, but didn't go straight to the desk, where the documents she had come to collect supposedly were. Instead, she stood there at the door, hidden in the shadows, watching David through the internal window that overlooked the main work area. He was completely absorbed in his work, moving with the precision of someone who had done that kind of task thousands of times before. There was something about his concentration, about the way he completely ignored her presence, that made the anger inside her explode into flames of pure hatred. "He's going to ruin me," she thought, and the realization was like poison running through her veins. "He'll investigate deeper, he'll find more evidence, and then he'll report me, and I'll lose everything." Panic set in, mixed with fury. If David exposed her, she would lose not only the money she had embezzled, but her freedom, her reputation, perhaps even custody of her daughter, who was in boarding school. "I can't let this happen," she whispered to the shadows. "I need to protect myself. I need to ensure he can never harm me." Her eyes scanned the workshop looking for something, although she herself didn't know exactly what, until her gaze settled on the tool bench near where she stood. She searched for a tool she could use for her desperate plan. She found what she needed, and with trembling hands and tears in her eyes, made a decision from which she could never turn back. "If he leaves this life in an accident," she thought, feeling tears begin to burn her eyes. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were of desperation and fear. "If something happens to him before he can expose me, I keep everything and nobody will ever know the truth." She didn't want to admit to herself that she was planning to kill her daughter's father, but survival had become her only instinct. Eleanor left the office, walking silently, keeping to the shadows. "I'm going to the bathroom," she said loudly enough for David to hear, but he just mumbled something unintelligible in response. Instead of going to the bathroom, Eleanor approached the car David was fixing, watching him from underneath while he worked on the upper part. The vehicle was raised on a hydraulic jack, with enough space underneath for someone to slide under if necessary. She knelt on the cold concrete floor, the knife still firm in her trembling hand, and began to crawl under the car with her heart beating so hard that she was sure David would hear it. But he continued working above, the sound of his tools drowning out any noise she made. Eleanor used her cell phone flashlight to illuminate the underside of the vehicle, looking for what she needed to find, and her eyes finally settled on the brake cables, the thin, resistant lines that connected the brake pedal to the wheels. Her hands trembled as she made the terrible decision. With tears in her eyes and cold determination, she did the unthinkable, knowing there would be no turning back. What happened in that moment would change everything forever. Eleanor slid back out from under the car, her heart beating so hard that she felt nauseated, and quickly put the knife back on the bench from where she had taken it. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably now, and she needed to lean against the wall for a moment to regain her balance. What had she just done? The weight of the action fell on her like an avalanche, and for a terrible moment she thought about running back, undoing what she had done, warning David about the danger. But then she thought about prison, about losing everything, about public shame, and the cold determination hardened her resolution again. "He forced me to do this," she told herself, building the narrative that would help her sleep at night. If he had just believed in me, if he wasn't investigating me, none of this would have been necessary. Eleanor quickly grabbed some random papers from the office desk, stuffed them into her bag, and walked towards the door with steps she tried to keep steady and normal. "I've found what I needed," she said to David, her voice coming out surprisingly normal despite the whirlwind of emotions. "I'm leaving now." David merely waved his hand without looking at her. "See you later," he said, and Eleanor felt something pierce through her chest. "See you later, David," she replied, and walked out the door, knowing that those might as well be the last words between them. The following morning dawned clear and cold, with the sun rising in a cloudless sky that promised a beautiful day. David had slept little, as had been happening lately, and woke up early to finish the final adjustments on the car that had been completed the night before. The client would come to pick it up at 9 in the morning, which gave him a few hours to run the final tests and ensure everything was working perfectly. He had a quick coffee in the small apartment above the workshop, dressed in clean clothes for the first time in days, and went down to the work area feeling strangely anxious. There was something in the air that bothered him, a feeling that something was wrong, though he couldn't identify exactly what. "You're becoming paranoid," he said to himself while doing a final visual check on the car. Just finish the job and deliver the vehicle to the client. He got into the car, started the engine, which purred smoothly, and began to guide the vehicle out of the workshop. "I'll just take a quick drive around the block," he muttered, "to make sure everything is working properly." Across the street, Eleanor had been sitting in her own car for more than an hour, observing the workshop through the windshield. She had spent the entire night awake, alternating between moments of absolute panic about what she had done and moments of cold determination that justified her actions as necessary for her survival. Now seeing David leave with the car, she felt her stomach turn and her heart race. Her face was divided between crushing guilt and a desperate need to protect herself, two emotions fighting for dominance in her conscience. Part of her wanted to scream, wanted to run to him and warn him about the brakes, wanted to undo the terrible mistake she had made the night before. But the other part, the part that fought for survival at any cost, kept her pinned to the car seat, silently watching as David drove away down the street. "It was necessary," she whispered to herself, trying to convince her own conscience. There was no other way out. He was going to destroy me. But the tears that began to stream down her face betrayed the fact that, deep down, she knew she had crossed a line from which she could never return. David drove calmly down the street, testing the acceleration, listening to the engines rumble, checking all the systems he had repaired. The car was responding perfectly, and he began to feel a little better, a little more in control despite the chaos his life had become. He approached the sharp curve at the end of the street, the one all local drivers knew and respected, because it was easy to lose control if you were going too fast. David wasn't going fast. He was actually below the speed limit, but when he stepped on the brake to make the turn, nothing happened. His foot sank all the way down without meeting any resistance, and cold panic hit him when he realized the brakes had completely failed. "No, no, no," he shouted, desperately pumping the pedal while the car continued forward. He tried to pull the handbrake, but the car was going too fast and the vehicle merely skidded out of control, the wheels completely losing traction. "God, help me!" David yelled, turning the steering wheel hard in a desperate attempt to make the turn, or at least minimize the inevitable impact. The car lost control and went off the road. The sound of the crash echoed through the quiet morning street. David felt the impact, and for a moment everything went dark. When he regained his senses, he realized the imminent danger around him. When he regained consciousness a few seconds later, he felt a growing heat and heard a crackling sound that made his blood run cold. As he came to, David realized that the car had caught fire. He needed to get out immediately. With effort, he tried to free himself as time worked against him. But his hands weren't obeying properly, and the seatbelt seemed to be stuck, and the smoke was getting thicker and thicker. "Someone help me!" he shouted in a hoarse voice, but the street was still deserted at that hour of the morning. From across the street, a few blocks away near an abandoned warehouse where they had spent the night, Thomas and Michael were rummaging through a dumpster, looking for something they could eat or perhaps sell to get some money. The old man still carried the hurt of being so unfairly expelled from the workshop, but also maintained a persistent concern for the man who, despite everything, had initially shown kindness. "Grandpa, is there anything here?" asked Michael, his little voice sounding tired and hungry. Thomas was about to answer when the crash echoed down the street, making both of them abruptly turn their heads toward the sound. "My God!" exclaimed the old man, his eyes widening at the sight of the column of smoke rising in the air. It was a crash. Michael grabbed his grandfather's hand tightly, his eyes wide with fear. "Grandpa, did someone get hurt?" he asked. Thomas didn't answer. He was already running toward the accident as fast as his old legs would allow, pulling the boy along. "Come, Michael," he said breathlessly. "Someone might need help." When Thomas and Michael arrived at the accident site, the old man stopped abruptly, his heart almost stopping when he recognized who was inside the burning car. "It's the mechanic," he said, his voice coming out in a horrified whisper. Michael saw David trapped in the vehicle, struggling to get out. "Grandpa, we need to help him," shouted the boy, and Thomas acted quickly. "Grandpa, he's going to die," shouted the boy, and Thomas felt something inside him activate, a sense of purpose that overcame any residual resentment. "Not if he's rescued now," said the old man with determination, his eyes looking around for something he could use. He spotted an iron bar lying on the ground near a pile of rubble. Thomas ran to it and picked it up, feeling the weight of the solid metal in his hands. "Stay behind me, Michael," he ordered, running toward the car with the bar raised. "And be ready to help when I call you." Thomas jammed the iron bar into the gap between the door and the car body, using it as a lever to force the damaged door open. The metal initially resisted, but with a shout of pure effort, the old man managed to create an opening large enough. "Michael!" he shouted over the roar of the flames that were beginning to spread. "Unbuckle his belt, quick!" The boy didn't hesitate, sliding through the narrow space and reaching David, who was semi-conscious, violently coughing. Michael pulled at the belt buckle with all the strength his small hands could muster, his fingers slipping on the first attempt because of sweat. "I can't do it, Grandpa," he cried. Thomas entered too, ignoring the intense heat. "Try again, son," he said, beginning to pull David by the shoulders. "You can do it." Michael bit his lip in concentration and pulled again, and this time the belt released with a click. "I did it!" he shouted. "Get out, son! Get out!" He yelled Thomas, pushing the boy out first and then dragging David with superhuman strength. They managed to pull David away from the vehicle seconds before it was completely consumed by flames. The intense heat hit them even at a distance, but they were all safe, gasping and covered in soot. David coughed violently, spitting black smoke, and when he finally managed to open his eyes and focus on the old man's face above him, his brain took a few seconds to process who it was. "You!" he managed to say in a hoarse, broken voice. "You saved my life." Tears began to stream down his face, leaving clean tracks in the soot. Thomas held his shoulder with a gentle but firm hand, and his old face was full of compassion. "God does not let the righteous fall into the trap of the liar," he said with a firm and compassionate voice, and there was something in his words that made David understand that the old man knew. "He protected you today, my son," Thomas continued, "and placed us here to be his instruments." David couldn't respond. He just cried as he hugged the old man and the boy he had so cruelly expelled. From a distance, hidden behind a parked vehicle across the street, Eleanor had watched everything with growing horror. She had followed David's car at a safe distance, watching with a mixture of dread and sick need to know if her plan would work. But when she saw the old man and the boy appear out of nowhere and risk their own lives to save David, when she saw her husband being dragged out seconds before the explosion, something inside her simply broke. Her legs began to tremble so violently that she could barely stand, and she had to lean on the car to keep from falling. Her face was completely pale, all color drained from her skin, and the orange light of the flames danced in her eyes, widened with absolute shock. "He is alive," she whispered to herself, barely able to believe it. "He survived." Despair overtook her like a wave. She covered her mouth with both hands to muffle a sob, watching David slowly get up with the help of the old man and the boy. "What have I done?" she asked aloud. "My God, what have I done?" Eleanor slowly backed away, keeping to the shadows and making sure no one saw her. Her steps were shaky and uncertain, and she stumbled twice before finally reaching her own car parked further away. She quickly got in, locked the doors with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, and sat there for a moment just breathing, trying to process what she had just witnessed. David was alive. Her plan had completely failed, and now there was no turning back. If he investigated the accident, if mechanics examined the brakes, they would discover the deliberate cut in the cable. And then he would know. He would finally know with absolute certainty that she had tried to kill him. "I need to leave," she said to herself, her voice coming out in panic. "I need to get out of here before it's too late." Eleanor started the car with trembling hands, reversed without looking in the rearview mirror, and sped away on the deserted road with no definite direction. All she could think about was escaping, putting distance between herself and what she had done, between herself and the inevitable consequences. "There's no going back now," she murmured between sobs as she drove faster and faster. No going back. The day dawned foggy and cold, with a dense mist covering the streets like a grey cloak that absorbed all sounds and transformed everything into ghostly silhouettes. News of the accident had spread through the neighborhood, with the characteristic speed of small communities, where everyone knows each other and any significant event becomes a topic of conversation. People were coming out of their houses still in pajamas to look at the charred remains of the car that had exploded on the curve, pointing and whispering among themselves about what could have caused such a terrible accident so early in the morning. The ambulance had arrived quickly after the heroic rescue by Thomas and Michael, and paramedics had taken David to the nearest hospital, while the two rescuers remained at the scene, giving their statements to police officers who appeared shortly afterward. David was now lying on a stretcher in the hospital emergency room, with bandages on various parts of his head and arms where he had been injured in the impact, but miraculously nothing serious or that would leave permanent damage. The doctor who examined him had said that he was very lucky, that it could have been much worse. "You're fine, sir," said the doctor, checking David's pupils with a small flashlight. "Just some cuts and bruises. Nothing that won't heal with time and proper rest." David merely nodded, still processing everything that had happened. He was lying there, looking at the white ceiling of the hospital and trying to organize his chaotic thoughts, when two police officers entered the room with serious, professional expressions. One of them was older, with graying hair and a posture that indicated years of experience, while the other was younger, holding a clipboard with papers. "Mr. David?" asked the older officer, approaching the bed. "I'm the detective in charge of investigating your accident this morning." David struggled to sit up in bed, feeling pain in muscles he didn't know existed. "Yes, that's me," he replied, his voice still hoarse from inhaling so much smoke. "Have you spoken to the old man and the boy who saved me?" The detective nodded affirmatively and pulled up a chair to sit beside the bed, his face maintaining that neutral expression that experienced police officers perfectly master. "Yes, we have, and they gave very detailed statements about what they saw and did," said the detective, crossing his hands over his lap. "But I'm here for another reason, Mr. David. I'm here because the preliminary technical reports on the vehicle have just arrived, and there's something you need to know." David felt his stomach tighten, a sensation of fear mixed with a terrible confirmation. "What do the reports say?" he asked, although part of him already knew the answer. The detective exchanged a look with the younger officer before turning his attention back to David, and there was something in his eyes that seemed to be compassion mixed with professional determination. "The technicians examined the remains of the vehicle, specifically the braking system," said the detective, his words measured and careful. "And what they found was not an accidental mechanical failure, Mr. David. It was deliberate sabotage." The word fell between them like a bomb, and David closed his eyes, feeling tears begin to burn behind his eyelids. He had suspected, of course, from the moment the brakes failed so completely and without warning, But hearing the official confirmation was different. It made real something that part of him still hoped was just paranoia. "The brake cable was intentionally cut," continued the sheriff, his voice growing deeper. "It wasn't a complete cut, it was strategic, calculated to fail under pressure, during use, to make it look like an accident." David opened his eyes and looked directly at the sheriff, and the police officer must have seen something in his expression, because he leaned forward. "Mr. David, do you have any idea who might want to harm you in this way?" he asked. "Someone who had access to your workshop, who knew enough about mechanics to know exactly where to cut." David was silent for a long moment, the weight of truth pressing on his chest like a stone. "I know who it was," David finally said, his voice coming out choked and laden with a complex emotion that was simultaneously pain, anger, and deep sadness. The sheriff picked up a pen and prepared to take notes, but David raised a hand asking for a moment. He needed to say it out loud, needed to make the definitive betrayal real, but the words were like glass in his throat. "It was my wife," he continued, and it was as if by saying those words he finally admitted to himself the full extent of the situation he was in. "Eleanor, my God. It was Eleanor." The sheriff didn't seem surprised, which made David realize that perhaps they already had their own suspicions, based on preliminary investigations and testimonies they had collected. "Are you certain of this?" asked the younger police officer, his pen hovering over the paper. "Do you have any proof or evidence you can share with us?" David thought about the box of documents, the hidden money, all the lies he had discovered in recent weeks. "I do," he answered, feeling a cold determination beginning to replace the sadness. "I have proof that she had been embezzling money from the workshop for some time. When she realized I was discovering everything, she planned something terrible that could have taken my life. The sabotage was intentional." The sheriff nodded gravely and stood up, placing his hand on David's shoulder in a gesture that was both comforting and professional. "We'll need you to make a formal statement as soon as you're feeling better," he said, putting away his pen. "And we'll need to examine all that evidence you mentioned about the embezzlement." He walked toward the door but stopped before leaving, turning back to David. "We've already issued an arrest warrant for your wife, Mr. David," the sheriff informed, his voice firm. "We have teams looking for her now, and based on the evidence we already have and your testimony, she won't be able to run for long." David felt something move inside him, relief mixed with sadness for what his life had become. "Thank you," he said simply, and the sheriff nodded before leaving the room with his younger partner. David was left alone again, but this time the silence seemed different. It seemed to have a weight of finality that didn't exist before. "It's over," he murmured to the empty room. "It's finally over." Meanwhile, several hours away on the road leading out of town, Eleanor was frantically driving her car loaded with hastily thrown luggage in the back seat and a backpack full of money she had managed to gather before fleeing. Her face was haggard and pale, with deep circles under eyes that were red and swollen from crying. During the entire night she had spent driving aimlessly, trying to decide where to go, what to do, how to escape the consequences of what she had done. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel, and she had to make a conscious effort to keep them steady enough to drive in a straight line. The gas tank was almost empty, she noticed with growing panic as she looked at the gauge, and she knew she would have to stop soon, even at the risk of being recognized. "Just a little more," she whispered to herself, her fingernails bitten until they bled, tapping nervously on the steering wheel. "I just need to get farther away, then I can figure out a plan. I can think clearly." But even as she said this, she knew she was lying to herself, knew there was no plan that could save her now. "What have I done?" she asked aloud for the 1,000th time, but the question remained unanswered. Eleanor finally spotted a gas station by the roadside, one of those small and somewhat abandoned establishments that mainly serve truck drivers and desperate travelers. She hesitated, considering whether she should continue driving and risk running out of fuel in the middle of nowhere, but the gauge was dangerously close to empty and she had no choice. Eleanor pulled into the gas station and parked at the pump furthest from the convenience store, keeping her sunglasses on despite the cloudy sky and pulling a scarf over her head in the pathetic hope of not being recognized. She got out of the car with trembling legs and began to fill up, her eyes nervously scanning the surroundings for any sign of police or someone who might recognize her. The station was relatively empty, except for a truck driver sleeping in his cab and a bored employee inside the store. "It's okay," she said to herself, pumping the fuel with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "Nobody knows who you are here. You're safe for now." But even as she tried to convince herself of that, she felt the crushing weight of guilt and fear pressing on her chest. "I just need to pay and leave," she muttered, watching the numbers on the pump slowly rise. "Quickly, before something goes wrong." When the tank was full, Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves, and walked to the convenience store to pay for the fuel. The clerk behind the counter was a tired-looking middle-aged man who barely looked up when she entered. Eleanor grabbed a bottle of water from the refrigerator and a packet of cookies that she knew she wouldn't be able to eat, but took anyway because she needed to maintain the appearance of normality. She approached the counter to pay, keeping her head down and avoiding eye contact, when something on the television hanging behind the clerk caught her attention and made her blood freeze in her veins. It was a local news broadcast, and on the screen, large and impossible to ignore, was her own photo, the one taken for the workshop document years ago, where she smiled confidently at the camera. "Police are looking for this woman," said the news presenter, her voice clear and professional, echoing through the silent store. "Eleanor, suspected of attempted homicide and embezzlement at a local auto repair shop, is considered dangerous and should be approached with caution." Eleanor was completely paralyzed, unable to move or breathe, watching in horror as her life crumbled on the screen in front of her. "Anyone with information about her whereabouts should contact the police immediately," continued the presenter, and then the screen showed images of the workshop, the destroyed car, David being taken to the ambulance. The disposable coffee cup that Eleanor had picked up from the counter fell from her trembling hands, shattering on the floor and spreading the dark liquid everywhere in a pattern that seemed grotesquely artistic. "No," she whispered, her whisper quickly turning into a cry of despair. "No, no, no, this can't be happening to me." The clerk finally looked up, first at the broken cup on the floor, then at Eleanor, and then at the television where her photo was still being displayed. And Eleanor saw the exact moment when he made the connection, when his eyes widened with recognition and his hand began to move toward the phone under the counter. Eleanor didn't wait to see what he would do, simply turned and ran toward the door, her shoes slipping on the spilled coffee and almost making her fall. "Wait!" shouted the clerk behind her. "You didn't pay for the fuel!" But Eleanor was already out of the store, running toward her car with her heart beating so hard she could barely hear anything else. "I need to get out of here," she said in panic, struggling to put the key in the ignition with hands that shook uncontrollably. "I need to leave now before the police arrive." She finally managed to start the car and began to reverse, but that's when she saw the blue and red lights. A police car entered the gas station from the opposite direction, probably having been alerted by the clerk, or perhaps just passing by chance. But Eleanor didn't care about the reason. She just knew she needed to escape. She floored the accelerator, making the tires screech against the asphalt as she tried to reverse and leave the station, but the police car quickly blocked her exit, parking directly behind her vehicle. Eleanor saw through the rearview mirror 2 police officers getting out of the patrol car with quick, coordinated movements, and absolute panic took over every cell of her body. "No, I can't be arrested, I can't!" She screamed to no one, throwing the gear into first and stepping on the accelerator again, this time toward the side exit of the station that led back to the road. The car jumped over the curb with an impact that made her head hit the ceiling, but she didn't stop, just kept driving desperately. "Turn off the vehicle!" shouted one of the officers through a megaphone. "Turn off the vehicle and get out with your hands up." But Eleanor was beyond reason now, operating purely on survival instinct, and continued driving until 2 more police cars appeared on the road ahead, completely blocking her escape. Eleanor stepped on the brakes so hard that her body was thrown forward against the seatbelt, and the car skidded to a stop in the middle of the road, surrounded by police vehicles from all sides. She looked around desperately, searching for a way out, any way out, but there was none. She was completely surrounded. The officers were getting out of their vehicles now, sheltered behind open doors, shouting instructions that Eleanor could barely process through the fog of panic in her mind. "Exit the vehicle with your hands visible," ordered one of them. "Get out now or we will be forced to use other means." Eleanor knew it was the end, knew there was nowhere else to run, but something inside her refused to accept, refused to surrender. She opened the car door and stumbled out, her legs barely supporting her, and then simply started running. "Stop!" shouted the police officers behind her. "Stop now!" But Eleanor kept running down the road, tripping over her own feet, until she finally fell to her knees in the damp mud at the roadside, her hands sinking into the cold dirt. "I'm not bad," she cried, her voice breaking into desperate sobs as the officers cautiously approached. "I'm not bad, I just wanted to protect what was mine. I just wanted to survive." One of the officers approached and firmly, but without brutality, made the arrest. Eleanor was detained by the authorities. Justice had finally caught up with her actions. "Mrs. Eleanor," said the officer, his voice surprisingly gentle considering the circumstances, "you are under arrest on suspicion of attempted murder, sabotage, and embezzlement." He helped her to stand, holding her arm to keep her stable as she sobbed uncontrollably. "Justice may be delayed," he continued, beginning to guide her toward one of the police cars. "But it always arrives, Mrs. Eleanor. It always arrives." Eleanor had no more strength to resist, to argue, to do anything but let herself be led to the police car like a doll without a will of her own. "My daughter," she said suddenly, briefly returning to reality. "My daughter is at boarding school. Someone needs to notify the school. She can't be left not knowing." The officer nodded and made a note on his radio. "We'll take care of that, Mom," he said. "Don't worry about that now." Back at the hospital in town, David was being discharged by the doctors with instructions for rest and to return in a week for removal of the stitches they had given for some of the deeper cuts. He was walking slowly down the corridor toward the exit, still feeling pain throughout his body, but infinitely grateful to be alive, when he passed the waiting room where a television was tuned to the local news. David stopped abruptly when he saw the images on the screen, showing Eleanor being placed in the police car, her hands cuffed behind her back and her face destroyed by tears and despair. The caption at the bottom of the screen said in large, clear letters that the suspect had been captured after a brief chase and was being taken to the central police station for questioning. David stood there, watching the woman he had loved, with whom he had built a life and a child, being taken away by the consequences of her own choices. He expected to feel satisfaction or anger or some kind of victory, but all he felt was a profound emptiness mixed with a sadness that seemed endless. "Now the workshop can breathe again," he murmured to himself, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. He knew it would take a long time to recover, not just physically, but emotionally, to rebuild what had been destroyed. David left the hospital and stood at the entrance for a moment, breathing in the cold morning air and feeling the weak sun trying to penetrate the fog that was finally beginning to dissipate. He saw Thomas and Michael sitting on a bench near the entrance, clearly waiting for him, and felt his heart tighten with gratitude and something that could be the beginning of a new hope. The old man stood up when he saw David, and his eyes shone with concern and compassion. "How are you feeling?" asked Thomas, approaching. David tried to smile, although it hurt to do so with his cracked lips. "I'm alive," he simply answered. "Thanks to you two, I'm alive." Michael ran to him and hugged his legs tightly, and David placed his hand on the boy's head, feeling tears begin to burn his eyes again. "I saw on the news that they arrested her," Thomas said softly. "Your wife." David nodded, not trusting his voice to speak at that moment. "It's over," he finally said. "Finally, all of this is over." Thomas placed his hand on his shoulder in a gesture of solidarity and understanding. "It's not over yet," the old man said wisely, "but now the new beginning can start." Far away on the road leading back to the city, the police car transporting Eleanor slowly moved away, its lights still flashing, but the sirens silent now that the chase had ended. Inside the vehicle, Eleanor sat in the back seat, handcuffs still on her wrists, looking out the window at the passing landscape without really seeing anything. Her face was pale, and her tears had dried, leaving trails of salt on her cheeks. She thought about her daughter at boarding school, about the life she had destroyed with her own hands, about the man she had tried to kill and who had miraculously survived. "How did I get here?" she asked quietly, but the police officer in the front seat didn't answer, probably thinking the question was rhetorical. And perhaps it was, because Eleanor knew exactly how she had gotten there. knew each selfish choice and each lie she had built over the years until finally everything crumbled. "There's no going back," she whispered to her reflection in the window. There really is no going back now. The police car continued down the road as the sun finally broke through the mist, bathing everything in golden light that promised a new day, a new beginning for some, but only the end for her. Outside the hospital, David, Thomas, and Michael remained there for a few more moments. Three souls that fate had unexpectedly intertwined through a night of storm and a series of events that none of them could have predicted. The sun slowly rose on the horizon, burning away the remaining mist and illuminating the city with a new light that seemed to symbolize exactly what Thomas had said, a new beginning. David looked at the brightening sky and felt, for the first time in a long time, something that could be the beginning of peace. "Let's go home," he finally said, looking at Thomas and Michael. "Let's go to the shop and let's see what can still be saved." Thomas smiled, a gentle smile that lit up his wrinkled face. "Yes," he agreed, "let's see what can be rebuilt." And together, the three walked toward the uncertain future, but at least free from the lies that had poisoned everything, as the sun fully rose on the horizon as a sign that even from the darkest ashes, something new can always begin to grow. 6 months had passed since that terrible morning of the accident, and the shop that David had built with so much sweat over 20 years had undergone a transformation that was both physical and symbolic. The walls that were once peeling and stained with old grease now shone with a new coat of white and blue paint, colors that brought a sense of cleanliness and renewal. The concrete floor had been polished and marked with organizational lines that divided the work areas efficiently and professionally. The old machines had been repaired and lubricated, now running with the smoothness of well-maintained equipment, and new tools hung neatly on the walls on panels that facilitated access and kept everything visible. But the most significant change, the one that made David's heart tighten with emotion every time he saw it, was the new sign at the entrance. Made of hand-painted metal with carefully drawn letters, it shone under the afternoon sun, with the words that David had personally chosen after much reflection. "Hope Workshop," the sign said in large and proud letters, and just below, in smaller but equally important letters, the slogan that summarized everything that place had become. "Where what is broken can be reborn," David murmured to himself, reading the words for the 1,000th time and still feeling the same wave of gratitude and purpose. Exactly that. That's exactly what this place is now. David was working on an engine on the central workbench, his hands moving with the confidence of decades of experience, disassembling and examining each part with meticulous attention. There was a serenity in his movements that didn't exist before, an inner peace that had been earned through months of therapy, difficult conversations, much crying, and hard work to rebuild not just the shop but himself. The scars of the accident still marked his forehead and arms, thin white lines that would probably remain forever, but he had learned to see them not as marks of trauma, but as reminders that he had survived, that he was alive, and had a second chance. The legal process against Eleanor had been long and exhausting, full of testimonies and hearings that forced David to relive the worst moments of his life repeatedly, but it had finally ended with a conviction that brought not satisfaction, but at least a sense of justice being done. The money she had stolen was never fully recovered, but insurance had covered part of the losses, and more importantly, the business had begun to thrive again with honest and transparent management. "We're good," David said aloud to the workshop, testing the weight of a piston in his hand. "We're finally really good." Across the shed, near the area where cars waited for maintenance, Michael was kneeling beside a dismantled engine on the floor, wearing a new work jumpsuit that still smelled of newly purchased fabric. The jumpsuit was dark blue with orange details, and on the chest pocket, carefully embroidered by a neighborhood seamstress whom David had hired especially for this, was the boy's name in elegant cursive letters. Michael was now 9 years old, had visibly grown in the last few months with regular meals and proper care, and his face that was once pale and haggard now had the rosy cheeks of a healthy child. He held a screwdriver too large for his small hands, but handled the tool with impressive determination, trying to loosen a stubborn screw from an engine part under David's watchful supervision. "It's too tight, Uncle David," said the boy, frowning in concentration. "I can't make it turn." David left his own work and walked to where Michael was, kneeling beside the boy, and placing his large hands over the child's small ones. "Like this, kid," he said gently, guiding the movements. "Slowly, no rush, feel the sound of the iron when the thread starts to give. It shows you when it's right." Together, they applied pressure until the screw finally yielded with a satisfying click. Michael let out a shout of joy and smiled so widely that his eyes almost disappeared in folds of pure happiness, and David felt his own heart warm with that smile. In the last few months, the boy had become something like a son to him, filling a void that David didn't even know existed in his life. Of course, he had his own daughter, who now visited regularly on weekends since the legal situation with Eleanor had been resolved and shared custody established. But there was room in his heart to love more than one child, to be the father figure that Michael had never had. "You're learning fast, Michael," David praised, affectionately ruffling the boy's hair. "Soon you'll be fixing engines by yourself and I'll be able to retire." The boy laughed, a crystalline sound that echoed through the workshop like music. "No, Uncle David," he said with childish seriousness. "You have to stay here forever and teach me everything you know, everything." David laughed too, feeling something inside him heal a bit more. "All right, kid," he agreed, getting up and returning to his own bench. "I'll stay here as long as you need me, I promise." Across the workshop, near the tool storage area that was now impeccably organized, Thomas worked with a sense of purpose and dignity that completely transformed his appearance. The old man was unrecognizable compared to the wet and desperate figure who had appeared at the workshop door that stormy night months ago. His white hair, which was once disheveled and dirty, was now neatly cut and carefully combed. His beard had been regularly trimmed, kept short and tidy, and his face, although still marked by the deep wrinkles of a difficult life, shone with a satisfaction and pride that only comes from having a purpose and being valued. He wore the same type of jumpsuit as Michael, though in adult size, and moved around the workshop with efficient movements, organizing tools, cleaning benches, checking the stock of parts, doing all the 1,000 small tasks that kept the operation running smoothly. His old calloused hands, which once trembled with hunger and fatigue, now worked with firmness and skill, polishing a wrench until it shone before carefully hanging it in its designated place on the panel. "Who would have thought, huh?" he said aloud to no one in particular, though he knew David was listening. "An old man like me having a real job again, with salary and everything, even hot lunch every day." His voice was laden with an emotion he didn't try to hide. David stopped his work and walked to where Thomas was, carrying a white envelope he had prepared earlier that morning and kept in his pocket, waiting for the right moment. He watched the old man work for a moment, admiring the dedication and care with which Thomas handled each tool, each part, as if they were precious treasures. And perhaps they were, David thought, because for a man who had nothing, who had lived on the streets caring for a grandson without a place to sleep or food to eat, having an honest job and a place to call his own must indeed seem like treasure. "Thomas," David called, and the old man turned with a smile that lit up his wrinkled face. "I have something for you, something I've been waiting for the right moment to give." He extended the envelope, and Thomas took it with hands that began to tremble slightly, not from weakness but from anticipation. "What is this?" asked the old man, looking from the envelope to David with confusion and hope mixed together. David smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Open it and see," he encouraged. "It's something you more than deserve." Thomas opened the envelope carefully, as if afraid of tearing something important, and pulled out the papers from inside, his eyes scanning the printed words with growing surprise and emotion. "It's a contract," said Thomas, his voice coming out in a strangled whisper. "A real work contract with my name and everything." His hands were trembling so much now that the papers visibly shook, and David had to hold the old man's elbow to keep him steady. "Yes," David confirmed, his own voice choked with emotion. "An official contract that makes you officially part of Hope Workshop, not just an employee, but a minority partner with profit participation." He pointed to a specific line in the document. "Here it says you're entitled to 10% of all business profits, besides your regular salary, and that you have job security as long as you want to work here." Thomas read and reread that line several times, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing, and then tears began to flow freely down his wrinkled face without him making any effort to stop them. "David," he finally managed to say, I don't know what to say. I don't deserve all this. David firmly shook his head, placing both hands on the old man's shoulders. You deserve this and much more, he said with absolute conviction. You saved my life, literally pulled me from a burning car when you had no obligation to do so, especially after how I treated you that night. His own voice began to break. You gave me a second chance to be a better person, and now I want to give you the chance to have a dignified life again. Thomas pressed the paper against his chest tightly, as if fearing it would disappear if he let go, and looked at David with eyes shining with gratitude and something that could be paternal love. Thank you, he said simply, because there weren't enough words in human language to express everything he felt in that moment. Thank you for believing in me when no one else did, for giving me a chance when I had already given up. David pulled the old man into a tight hug, ignoring the grease on his own clothes and the tears wetting his shoulder. We're a family now, said David, and realized as he said it that it was absolutely true. You, me and Michael, we're a family that fate brought together. They stayed like that for a long moment, two men who had been broken by life in different ways, but who had found redemption and purpose in each other. Michael, observing the scene from where he was, put his tools aside and ran to join the hug, wrapping his small arms around both men's waists. I love you, said the boy with the simple honesty of children. I love you both very much. And so the three remained an unlikely but real family in the middle of the workshop that had become their shared sanctuary. Life at Hope Workshop had fallen into a comfortable and productive rhythm that brought satisfaction to everyone involved. Mornings began early, with David opening the gate at 7 o'clock and preparing strong coffee in the small kitchen they had installed in a corner of the renovated office. Thomas arrived soon after, having walked from the small apartment David had helped him rent 2 blocks away, bringing Michael, who now studied at a nearby school and spent afternoons and weekends helping in the workshop. The customers began to return gradually, first the old ones who had remained loyal during the difficult times, and then new customers attracted by the growing reputation for honest and quality work. The local community had embraced the story of the three, speaking with admiration about the mechanic who had risen from the ashes, the good-hearted old man who had saved a life by risking his own, and the boy who had found a home and a future in a place that previously seemed doomed. Have you heard about Hope Workshop? People would say to each other at the market, church, and bus stops, it's more than just a place to fix cars, it's a place where lives are fixed too. And so the business thrived not just because of technical skill, but because of the human story behind it. But while life flourished at Hope Workshop, somewhere far away, Eleanor lived a completely different reality. She had served 18 months of her 3-year prison sentence, benefiting from good behavior and overcrowding in the prison system. But those 18 months had been enough to completely break what remained of the woman she had been. Prison had stripped her of all masks and pretensions, forcing her to confront daily the consequences of her choices and actions. She had lost everything, absolutely everything, during that time. Her daughter, now living permanently with David under exclusive custody granted by the court, barely spoke to her during the rare permitted visits, looking at her mother with a mixture of fear and disappointment that was more painful than any physical punishment could be. The possessions she had accumulated over the years, purchased with stolen money, had been confiscated or sold to pay restitution and fines. Her reputation was destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery. Her name permanently associated with scandal and crime, in a small community where such things were never forgotten. I lost everything, she would whisper to herself at night in her cell. Lost my daughter, my freedom, my dignity, all because of my own greed and fear. When she was finally released, Eleanor discovered that the world outside had no place for her. Nobody wanted to hire an ex-convict convicted of theft and attempted homicide, no matter what skills she might have. Doors closed in her face repeatedly, sometimes literally, when potential employers searched her name online and found newspaper articles detailing her crimes. She quickly exhausted what little money she had left, spending it on a tiny room in a cheap boarding house where the walls were thin enough to hear every fight and every cry of the equally desperate neighbors. Hunger once again became a constant companion, as did the despair and regret that corroded her from the inside like acid. It was only after weeks of searching, humiliating herself at dozens of places, that she finally found someone willing to give her a chance. "You can work here," said the owner of a roadside mechanic shop, a burly man with a hard expression and eyes that showed no compassion. "But it won't be glamorous, I'll make that clear. You'll do the dirty work that nobody else wants to do." Eleanor, too desperate to have pride, accepted immediately. "I'll do anything," she said, hating the pleading tone in her own voice. "I just need a job, a chance." The man smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "Then start tomorrow morning," he ordered, "and don't be late because I don't tolerate laziness here." The work at the roadside shop was brutal and humiliating in ways that Eleanor could never have imagined in her previous life. She spent her days covered in grease up to her elbows, cleaning mud-caked tires, washing oil-stained floors, organizing heavy parts that made her back ache, doing all the lowest and most degrading work while the real mechanics did the technical work. The truckers who stopped there often made cruel jokes about her, laughing at her unkempt appearance and her obvious situation of desperation, and she had to swallow the humiliation and smile because she needed that miserable job to survive. The boss yelled at her constantly, criticizing every small mistake and threatening to fire her for trivial infractions, keeping her in a constant state of anxiety and fear. "You're the most incompetent person who's ever worked here," he would shout when she accidentally spilled a bucket of dirty water. "If I weren't so desperate, I would send you away right now." Eleanor fell silent, lowered her head, and went back to work, because what else could she do? There was no one to defend her, no one who cared, no one who saw anything in her beyond a useless ex-convict who was lucky to even get that horrible job. "I'm sorry," she would mumble, wiping up the water with an old rag. "It won't happen again." But it did happen, because she was so tired, so broken inside, that she could barely concentrate on simple tasks. The days dragged on one after another in a painful grey monotony, each exactly like the one before, with no hope of change or improvement. Eleanor woke up before dawn in her tiny room, put on the same dirty clothes from the day before because she didn't have money to buy more, and walked the 3 kilometers to the workshop because she couldn't afford transportation. She worked 12 hours under the scorching sun or cold rain, depending on the weather, ate a miserable meal of leftovers that her boss allowed her to take from the adjacent diner, and then walked the 3 kilometers back, arriving home too late and too exhausted to do anything other than fall onto the hard bed and sleep a restless sleep full of nightmares. There were no friends, no family, no one who cared whether she lived or died. Her daughter had completely stopped responding to her letters, and David had made it clear through his lawyers that he wanted no contact with her. "You are alone," Eleanor said to her reflection in the cracked mirror of her room one night. "Completely and absolutely alone, and you brought this on yourself." The reflection that looked back at her showed a woman she barely recognized, with grey, disheveled hair, a face prematurely aged by stress and regret, empty, dull eyes that had lost all the vivacity and cleverness they once possessed. "Who are you?" she asked the reflection. "What have you become?" But the reflection had no answers, just stared back with the same empty, defeated expression. It was on a particularly difficult afternoon, when Eleanor was on her knees washing the workshop floor, while the mechanic stepped over her without even acknowledging her presence, that she heard the sound of a familiar engine approaching. She looked up from the bucket of dirty water and saw through the open door of the workshop a car slowly passing by on the road, probably looking for the gas station further ahead. But it wasn't the car that captured her attention and made her heart skip a beat. It was the magnetic sign attached to the side of the vehicle, bright blue and white letters that were impossible to miss. "Hope Workshop," the sign said in large, proud letters that seemed to shine even under the afternoon sun. "Where what is broken can be reborn." Eleanor was paralyzed there, kneeling on the dirty floor with a soaked rag in one hand, watching that car slowly move away until it disappeared from view, and something inside her finally broke completely in a way it hadn't until then. Tears began to stream down her face, silent at first, but then coming in sobs that shook her entire body, and she had to bite the rag to muffle the sounds because she couldn't let her boss or the others see her crying. "Hope Workshop," she repeated to herself through the tears. "Where what is broken can be reborn." The irony was so cruel that it almost made her laugh, almost, because while David and those he had taken in found rebirth and hope, she was here, broken beyond any possibility of repair, without hope and without a future. "I could have had that," she whispered to the wet floor. "If I had made different choices, if I had been a different person, I could have been part of that hope instead of being here, destroyed and alone." She closed her eyes tightly, trying to block the image of that sign from her mind, but it was too late. It was permanently etched there, along with all the other regrets and losses. Eleanor thought of David, whom she had tried to kill, who had survived and built something beautiful from the ashes she had left. She thought of his kind face, of the patience he had always had with her before she destroyed everything with her greed and fear. She thought of her daughter, who now had a stable home and a father who truly cared, something Eleanor had never managed to provide because she was always too busy thinking about herself. She thought of the old man and the boy, two people she had never known but had heard about during the trial, two people who had saved David's life and found a family in the process. "They achieved what I lost," she said to no one, opening her eyes and returning to work because the boss was looking in her direction with an impatient expression. "They found hope in a new beginning, while I'm trapped here in a hell of my own making." She dipped the cloth in the bucket and went back to scrubbing the floor, but tears kept falling, mixing with the dirty water and disappearing without a trace, exactly like she herself had become, someone who existed but didn't matter, someone who had been and was no longer anything. Back at Hope Workshop, completely unaware of Eleanor's suffering in her personal hell, David was finishing the day's work with a sense of satisfaction that only comes from doing something you love, surrounded by people you value. The afternoon sun came through the clean windows of the workshop, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced on the freshly painted walls and made everything shine with an almost magical quality. Michael had just finished his task of organizing a set of tools and was now playing with an old radio they had fixed earlier, turning the dial until finding a station that played soft and melodic music. "Can I leave it on, Uncle David?" asked the boy, looking hopeful. David smiled and nodded affirmatively, appreciating how the music filled the space and made everything even more welcoming. "Yes, you can, kid," he answered, cleaning his greasy hands on a cloth that Thomas had just washed and hung to dry. "Good music makes work lighter." He looked around the workshop, seeing everything they had built together, and felt a wave of gratitude so intense that it almost knocked him down. "Come on, boys," he said, his voice filled with contentment and peace. "There are still plenty of engines to fix, and that's a good thing. It's a blessing to have work and to have you two here with me." The sun invaded the workshop through the windows and the open door, bathing everything in a golden warm light that seemed to bless every corner, every tool, every surface, with a promise of continuity and prosperity. Thomas came to join David and Michael in the center of the workshop, and the three stood there for a moment, just absorbing the peace and satisfaction of the moment, aware in an unspoken way of how their lives had changed, of how fate had intertwined three completely different souls into a tapestry of redemption and hope. They were the mechanic who had lost everything and found renewed purpose in helping others, the old man who had been discarded by society but had proven he still had value and dignity to offer, and the boy who had been born in difficult circumstances but now had a chance at a better future. Three destinies that crossed in pain, thought David, looking at his two companions with paternal love, and were reborn in kindness, compassion, in giving each other a second chance when the world had already given up on all of us. The music from the radio continued to play softly, blending with the sounds of the workshop and the street outside, creating a symphony of everyday life that was, in its simplicity, absolutely perfect. Did you like the story of David, Thomas, and Michael? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.